Chapter 063 The March of Days. To the north of Nyazov, very deep inside the northern wilderness, there was a small, inconspicuous gully with an equally unremarkable cave carved into one of its walls. It was unlikely that anyone who stumbled upon the area would think much of it, though if they were very perceptive or experienced in the ways of the forest, they might have noted that the place felt surprisingly peaceful. Yet, it was anything but. The inhabitant of the cave was vicious and powerful, and many creatures had paid with their lives for trespassing into its area. The peaceful atmosphere was simply the result of the beast killing anything edible or threatening in its immediate domain, which caused the larger and more intelligent creatures to avoid the area. Despite knowing all of this, someone was about to barge into the place and provoke the Grey Hunter Mother lurking inside the cave. Floating high in the air above the area was a wooden platform densely covered in crystalline glyphs, and standing upon it was a teenager that looked like Zorian but arguably wasn't. He was Zorian's simulacrum, and he had been sent here to die. From his safe location high in the sky, the simulacrum stared at the pitch-black entrance to the Grey Hunter's lair, nervously fiddling with the watch-like device in his pocket that controlled the platform he was standing on. It would be lying to say he wasn't apprehensive about what he was expected to do. True, this had been his own idea, back when he and the original were still one and the same, but, well, it was one thing to decide to create a copy of yourself to serve as bait for a giant man-eating spider, and quite another to come into existence and realize you are to be that bait. He was made in his creator's image. And Zorian? He had a very strong survival instinct. He couldn't remember ever being suicidal, and even after being trapped inside a time loop he shied away from risking his life without a good reason. He was scared. There, he said it. He was not just apprehensive, he was flat-out scared. How could he not be? He was going to be torn apart by a giant spider, and he was supposed to just stand there and let it happen. It was. He shook his head, doing his best to calm his thoughts. He chose this. He remembered making this plan, remembered all the arguments for why it had to be this way, and it was all just as valid now as it was then. It was only his own cowardice that was making him hesitate now. And while Zorian had never been, nor was likely to ever be some kind of paragon of bravery, he was better than this. Still, less than an hour ago, he had been willing to sacrifice his copy for this. He distinctly remembered this. It felt like his own decision, even though he technically didn't even exist back then. What did it say about him that he had been so cavalier about the decision back then, but now that he was to be said sacrifice, he found himself having doubts? One of the rings hanging around his neck suddenly vibrated for a moment. The original was trying to contact him. He sent a telepathic probe into the ring in question, which was actually a miniature telepathic relay, and formed a connection with the mind of true Zorian. He briefly wondered if it was possible to use their soul as a telepathic conduit in lieu of their artificial relays, since they shared one and all. However, he knew too little about soul magic to judge how difficult such an idea would be, so he put the thought aside. "Ready?" the original Zorian asked. The simulacrum hesitated, just for a moment. The original seemed confident. The fear and anxiety that plagued the simulacrum were entirely absent from his progenitor's thoughts. Instead, the original seemed expectant, even excited. What vast differences in thinking, and they had diverged so recently from one another. Well, no matter. Strangely enough, he didn't blame the original for his attitude. What sense would that make? In the past several restarts since Zorian had acquired the simulacrum spell, he had relentlessly practiced it. By now, any copy he produced was a pretty good rendition of the original. The simulacrum was confident that he was cut from the same cloth as the original Zorian, so chances are that he would have behaved the same if their positions were reversed somehow. If he cursed Zorian, he cursed himself. "I'm ready," the simulacrum sent back. After a moment's hesitation, he also enclosed his thoughts on using their soul as a telepathic conduit inside a memory packet and sent them over the link to the original. Just in case the original Zorian didn't have the same idea for some reason. There was a short pause as the original seemed to consider things. When he finally responded a few seconds later, It was with but a single word. Go. The simulacrum didn't argue or stall for time. He immediately pressed a button on the watch-like device in his pocket, causing the wooden platform to plunge downward with dizzying speed. Somehow, now that the moment of truth had finally come, he was able to discard all his worry and hesitation and act decisively. He was still scared, but there was also determination there. Or maybe it was just resignation? Either way, as he watched the ground rapidly get closer and closer, he knew that he could do it. He could play the role he was meant to play. Though he was currently standing on a piece of wood hurtling towards the cold, unforgiving ground, the simulacrum wasn't worried about crashing into the ground and dying. The platform wasn't actually falling in the classical sense, as evidenced by the fact it stayed aligned horizontally with the ground instead of flipping around randomly through the air. It was a magical travel device executing a controlled descent, and the simulacrum had full faith in its construction. He remembered making it, after all. No, all of his worry and attention was being directed at the unassuming cave entrance in the gully. He had come to terms with being torn apart by a giant murder spider in the near future. Well, mostly, but whether or not his death would achieve anything was still an open question. The plan wasn't complicated. He just had to lure the Grey Hunter mother into stepping onto the very wooden platform beneath his feet, which would cause the multitude of traps and restrictive wards anchored to it to activate, sealing the spider's fate. The problem was that the Grey Hunter was quite canny about recognizing traps. Thus his current method of entry. In theory, suddenly dropping out of the sky right into the middle of the Grey Hunter's territory should catch the spider off guard and enrage it enough for it to rush out and attack him without making sure it wasn't blundering into a trap. In theory. In practice, the Grey Hunter was annoyingly unpredictable. This wasn't the first time Zack and Zorion were fighting the thing, and their previous clashes with it were. Well, they managed to eke out a win in the end. For a certain definition of win. The Grey Hunter was dead in the end, yes, but in one restart Zack ended up being bitten and couldn't cast anything for the rest of the restart, and in the other Zorion had both of his legs shattered so thoroughly it took him an entire week to heal, even with the best medical care money can buy. Gods, that was painful. Thankfully, he was just a copy mind inhabiting an ectoplasmic shell, so he wouldn't be suffering through a repeat of that experience. He had no bones to break, after all. Hopefully the trap would work. It would be nice to get the spider's egg sac intact, something they hadn't managed to accomplish up until now, if only so he could rub the achievement into Silver Lake's face. But barring that, Zorion would settle for a proper victory instead of a Pyrrhic win that left them in recovery for the rest of the restart. The simulacrum frowned. You know what? He wasn't taking chances with this. If he had to die, he at least wanted his death to be meaningful and achieve something. Thus, just before he hit the ground, he dipped into the mana reserves he shared with the original and cast a hasting spell on himself. He immediately felt the world slow down around him, the spell accelerating his personal time flow by about 2.5 times. This was not part of the plan. In fact, the original was probably cursing him right now to hell and back for wasting a good chunk of his precious mana reserves. But the haste effect might let him react fast enough to the Grey Hunter's moves to actually achieve his mission, so the original would just have to deal with it. The platform hit the ground with surprising gentleness, the powerful wards emanating from it blunting the force of the impact until it could barely be felt. But the simulacrum still felt it and stumbled in place for a second. He recovered almost immediately, but by then the Grey Hunter was already making its move. What a fast response! It would seem they had underestimated the murder spider once again, because less than a second since the platform touched the ground, the Grey Hunter was already jumping out of the cave entrance. It must have detected the intrusion while the simulacrum was still in the air and was already on the move by the time the wooden platform hit the ground. With his accelerated perceptions, the simulacrum could see the furry, many-legged body of the Grey Hunter sailing through the air in all of its terrible detail. The huge glossy fangs, the soulless black eyes, the quill-like fur covering its entire body. The simulacrum was not ashamed to admit he froze in place for a moment. He regained his wits quickly though, just in time to see the Grey Hunter slam into the ground next to the gully, kicking up dust and gravel as it immediately launched itself back into the air again. He watched the beast intently, trying to think of the best way to keep it contained on the platform long enough for the traps to fully activate. But something was wrong. The Grey Hunter was going too high and too fast. At that speed and at that angle of ascent, the spider was. Damn it, it was going to overshoot his location entirely. It wasn't taking the bait. Maybe it could understand that the platform was a trap, or maybe it knew that the simulacrum was just an ectoplasmic construct and thus didn't find him threatening enough. Whatever it was, the Grey Hunter decided to completely ignore Zorian's simulacrum and the platform he was standing on. At the moment, the simulacrum was torn between feeling amused and being annoyed. On one hand, having the murder spider ignore him entirely after all that inner turmoil he went through was kind of funny. But the fact that the spider was clearly going after the original instead was bad and objectively the worst way this mission could have ended. A simulacrum like him was a lot more expendable than the original was. He thought about trying to telekinetically snare the Grey Hunter and draw it into the trap, or get its attention by using mind magic. But his memories told him that could never work. The Grey Hunter had insanely high magic resistance, and trying to affect it with magic directly was like trying to hold a live eel. An exercise in frustration. Instead, he tried something else. As the Grey Hunter was passing overhead, the simulacrum created a thick rope of magical force and tried to use it to entangle the Grey Hunter and reel it in onto the platform. Unfortunately, the spider twisted its body in midair, avoiding the rope by a centimeter or so. It then managed to right itself fast enough to land solidly on its feet, landing a good distance behind the platform. Frustrated at the way he was failing his mission, the simulacrum tried to get the Grey Hunter's attention by firing a ball of entangling ectoplasmic threads at its back. He knew from experience that the Grey Hunter was strong enough to break through the spell, but, humiliatingly enough, the spell didn't even hit it properly. The spider reacted instantly, rolling to the side to avoid the bulk of the spell. A few threads did manage to snag it, wrapping themselves tightly around its legs, but the Grey Hunter just accelerated forward, gouging out clumps of grass from the forest floor as its legs sought greater traction, and the threads that tried to restrain it snapped like they were made of straw. It then sped off into the distance, zigzagging a few times to avoid the handful of overpowered magic missiles the simulacrum had sent after it as a parting gift. Despite being overpowered and cast in haste, the missiles were only faintly visible, existing only as a slight discoloration in the air, a testament to Zorian's mastery of the spell. Despite this, not only could the Grey Hunter evidently perceive them without even turning around, it moved with sufficient speed and agility to defeat their homing function and dodge them anyway. That shouldn't even be possible, damn it. The simulacrum stared at the dust trail left behind by the Grey Hunter, taking a deep breath to calm himself even though he was just an ectoplasmic construct and didn't really need to breathe. The damn spider didn't even have the decency to turn around and pay attention to him upon being attacked, never mind being tempted to step on the platform. It treated the simulacrum like it was just a particularly aggressive rock or something, instead of an actual threat. Well, his mission was certainly a failure, but maybe he could help the original in some other way. He started running after the monster and sent a message to the original through the relay hanging around his neck, asking for directions. The original had been observing the event through his senses, so he didn't have to explain much. He was immediately told to observe only and stop wasting mana for now. Wow, what a jerk. He supposed he had been a little wasteful with their shared mana reserves, but come on. He was just trying to salvage the situation somehow. When he finally caught up to the Grey Hunter, he came upon the site of a battlefield. Zack and Zorian were both engaging the Grey Hunter, along with a group of golems, 2 big and slow ones for defense and 10 smaller and faster ones to act as distractions. The Grey Hunter hurled itself at Zorian, the original one, only to crash into a thick multicolored plate of force and bounce off. Zack tried to take advantage of this and impale it, sending a trio of black javelins at it. But the spider reoriented itself in an instant, dancing around the projectiles like a leaf in the wind and hurled itself back towards Zorian again the moment its legs touched the ground. It zigzagged across the ground, kicking up dust and gravel and unerringly dodging every trap that had been hidden in the area beforehand, including some purely non-magical ones like hidden pits and iron bear traps. Zack did his best to hit it with a multitude of projectile spells, and Zorian directed his golems to block it and try to push it into one of said projectiles or the traps it was avoiding. It was all for naught. The Grey Hunter's agility and speed was unreal, and the few times it ended up boxed in by the attacks and the traps, it unfailingly identified which attack it could tank without getting hurt. Zack launched a dense sphere of rock at the back of the boxed-in spider, only for it to kick back with its rear legs like a horse and shatter the sphere of magically hardened rock like it was just loosely packed earth. Zorian managed to hit it with a powerful incinerating ray, but all that did was burn off some of the dense fur covering its body and didn't seem to do any lasting damage. Zack trapped it in a cage of dense, layered force, but the Grey Hunter mother shattered each one like it was made of paper and burst free before Zack and Zorian could strengthen the prison enough to hold her. One of the smaller golems managed to latch onto the Grey Hunter's back. Without hesitation, the spider rammed itself backwards into a tree, causing the golem to let go. The simulacrum watched all this, observing the battle and waiting for the right moment to act. He knew that, despite Zack and Zorian's apparent lack of success at damaging the Grey Hunter, the situation was under control at the moment. The two of them had fought the beast twice already, and though they suffered a heavy price each time, they also learned how to keep it at bay and put pressure at it. The only reason why the Grey Hunter hadn't fallen yet was that neither Zack nor Zorian were trying their hardest to kill it yet. They were still hoping to get its eggs relatively intact, so they couldn't use area of effect spells as indiscriminately as they should against an opponent like this. Sure enough, while the battle failed to kill the Grey Hunter, it was steadily getting pushed back towards the wooden platform as the minutes ticked by. The spider seemed to realize it was getting herded into a trap, however, and stubbornly refused to get pushed onto it. Finally, after both Zack and Zorian were starting to run out of mana and get physically exhausted, and all but two of the smaller golems had been reduced to scrap, the two finally managed to trick the Grey Hunter into a trap. Zorian deliberately left himself somewhat open, casting his defensive plane of force relatively high, and the Grey Hunter took the bait and tried to slide under it to get to Zorian. Perhaps it was getting tired itself and decided to take the chance. Regardless, Zorian had been ready for it and promptly materialized a dimensional gate in front of himself. A gate whose exit point led straight onto the wooden platform. The spider tried to twist itself in midair to dodge it, but Zack used a powerful gust of wind to push it in anyway. And then, just as it was going to slam into the wooden platform and get snared, the Grey Hunter revealed its final trump card. It shot a strand of silk out of its back end and used it as a lifeline to reel itself to the side of the platform, avoiding it entirely. "Okay, that does it," Zack growled. "We're taking it down, damn the eggs." "Fine," Zorian agreed unhappily. The simulacrum could understand the original's frustration. They were so close to total victory. One of the remaining golems tried to push the Grey Hunter onto the platform again, only for the spider to do a backflip, there is no other way to describe it, and land right on top of the golem. It then pushed itself off, using the golem's head as leverage to propel itself away from the risk zone, and shoved the golem straight into the platform in the process. And yet so far away. A giant firestorm suddenly consumed the entire area, courtesy of Zack, and for the first time in the battle, the Grey Hunter screamed. It was fast and tough, but it couldn't dodge a spell that affected such a wide area, and a fire so intense was beyond it to fully shrug off. It was not dead, but large patches of its fur were gone and two of its eyes had burst from the heat. Its egg sac was reduced to ash in its entirety. The Grey Hunter mother let loose an ear-splitting screech of rage for her destroyed eggs and went completely berserk. No longer caring to avoid damage, the spider rushed at Zack, who it correctly identified as the source of the firestorm, at even greater speeds than before. It charged straight through the hail of projectiles launched at it by both Zack and Zorian, losing a leg and another eye in the process, and kept going. It almost succeeded at sinking its fangs into Zack's chest, but Zorian managed to recall the boy way before the strike could connect. A berserk Grey Hunter was dangerous. They became less cautious and more willing to tank damage in order to inflict some of their own in turn. In their previous clashes with the Grey Hunter Mother, they had been caught off guard by the change in tactics, which was how Zorian had gotten both of his legs broken. This time, though, they were ready for it. And for someone who knew what was coming, a berserk Grey Hunter was actually easier to fight than a calm one. An area-wide freezing spell from Zack, a ball of shredding force from Zorian, and a collective sacrifice from the remaining golems dogpiling it and self-destructing themselves, and the Grey Hunter was finally dead. Its mangled corpse looked like a living war zone, but as far as the simulacrum was concerned, the fact it still remained in one piece after everything it went through is already amazing. "It's a shame," the original said, approaching the corpse to inspect it. "I really thought we had a chance of getting its eggs this time." "I'm just glad I didn't get bitten again," Zack said, rubbing his chest as if trying to ward off phantom pain. "Thanks for the save back there. Anyway, you shouldn't be too greedy. This thing is a pain to fight, even when we are going all out, never mind trying to capture it. We still have its corpse in reasonably good condition, which means we can make those awesome magic perception potions again. That's reward enough if you ask me." The simulacrum smiled, remembering how shocked Locave had been when they had brought a Grey Hunter corpse to him in one of the restarts and asked him to turn it into an enhancement potion. Unfortunately, Grey Hunters were so rare and dangerous to hunt that there was no publicly available potion recipes involving them, never mind the specific one that granted the imbiber its senses. Locave couldn't do it. It was beyond his pay grade, he said. All he could do was give them a list of better alchemists that could be able to help them, though he warned them that even they would probably have to invent a new potion from scratch in order to fulfill their request. Zack and Zorian had to spend 2 weeks visiting various potion makers recommended by Locave till they found one that was capable of working with the corpse in their hands, and even then it took the woman more than a single restart to create the potion. They had to give her the research notes she had made herself in the previous restart and make something up to explain how they had them. In the end they did get a recipe of turning dead Grey Hunters into powerful potions of mana perception, but the issues involved had finally convinced Zorian to start learning how to make transformation potions himself. He was still a rank beginner in the field, but even the little he knew was useful. Eagle Eye potions were surprisingly easy to make, and the visual acuity they gave was amazing. "Yes, exactly," the simulacrum said, approaching the group and startling Zack. "You're still here?" Zack asked. "Oh, right," Zorian did say. "The spider ignored you entirely." "Yeah, the Grey Hunter had absolutely no interest in me whatsoever. I guess it could tell I'm a simulacrum. Its senses are really something." "It's something all right," Zack said. "Zorian, are you sure that thing isn't intelligent?" "Yes," Zorian said. "I can't affect its mind, but my mind sense works on it just fine and I can judge its sapience. It's dumber than a troll. But it's still about as smart as a crow or a boar," the simulacrum protested against his creator. "It's got animal cunning. Do you remember how Zack dragged us into that bar in Yazov Vary and then started a drunken conversation with that group of hunters?" "Ugh, how could I forget?" Zorian said. "You know, Zorian, watching you talk to yourself like that is pretty damn surreal," Zack pointed out. Neither the simulacrum nor the original acknowledged him in any way. "Anyway," continued the simulacrum. "At one point the hunters spoke about being hired to stop wild boars from destroying the crops around the city and complained about how quickly the wild boars learned to recognize and avoid traps. They said the boars even learned how to spot magical setups, despite not having any magic perception as far as anyone knew." "Yes, but those are learned skills," Zorian said, frowning. "The boars have to be constantly exposed to traps to learn how to deal with them. The Grey Hunter didn't have any chance to learn like that." "How do you know that?" the simulacrum countered. "It's Silver Lake who sent us to this place, remember? Logically, this means she tried to retrieve the eggs herself and failed. I rather doubt she tried to fight the Grey Hunter head-on, so she used traps," Zorian said, finally reaching the same conclusion the simulacrum had. "She used all sorts of traps, and all she did was teach it how to recognize and avoid them. Zorian looked absolutely outraged at the fact Silver Lake had basically trained the Grey Hunter on how to respond to human attackers and never even bothered to tell them about it, but Zack just laughed lightly. "Deceptive mission givers, how nostalgic," he said. "I remember the first time I got screwed over by one. I was even more incensed than Zorian here. That aside, Zorian, I'm amused that your simulacrum figured it out before you yourself did. How does that work?" "Differing perspectives," the simulacrum said with a light shrug. "We diverged a few measly hours ago," Zorian said dismissively. "Just how different could our perspectives be?" The simulacrum frowned, a little annoyed at the response. He didn't answer with words. Instead he forced the connection to Zorian's mind and blasted him with a few choice memories. The nerve-wracking wait before the platform's descent. The terrifying sight of the Grey Hunter jumping out of the cave and seemingly towards him. The feeling of frustration and powerlessness as he watched the battle without being able to meaningfully contribute anything. Zorian gasped and took a step back, caught off guard by this sudden pseudo-attack, and gave him a shocked look. "Very different," the simulacrum said, and then deliberately collapsed his own ectoplasmic body and dissolved into smoke. His job was done, anyway. Break. It was a beautiful sunny day, and Zorian was standing on an abandoned field, far from anything dangerous or important. He wasn't alone. Standing around him was a group of familiar people: Zack, Taven, Amaya, Kirill, Kana and Kale. They were all gathered around a stone table that Zorian had created out of the nearby ground, watching the potion bottles lined up in the center of it. Each had a slightly different reaction. Zack looked mildly interested but otherwise calm and collected. Taven had a distant, thoughtful expression, seemingly consumed in her own thoughts and barely even conscious of her surroundings. Amaya seemed torn between quiet excitement and apprehension, occasionally glancing at Kirill and Kana with a small frown. She probably thought they were too young to be here. Considering the unhappy, sour look that Kale was giving Zorian, he probably agreed with that conclusion. Zorian was unrepentant, though. If Kale didn't want Kana here, he could have just refused to bring her along. It wasn't Zorian's fault that Kale was too weak to resist his daughter's whining and relented to her request in the end. As for Kirill, well, she was practically vibrating on her feet from excitement, staring at the potion bottle like she wanted to swallow it with her eyes. A bit comical, but Zorian could understand. It wasn't every day that you got a chance to turn into a bird and fly. "All right," Zorian finally said. "I'm giving you all one last chance to back out." Besides Kirill's loud no, he received no response. He assumed that meant none of them were stepping out at the last moment, but just to be sure he gave Kale a curious look, since he seemed to be the one most against this. Kana, whom Kale was currently holding in one hand, noticed the look and gave her father a quiet whine, as if warning him to not even think about sending her away. Kale responded with an amused snort and a casual tap against her forehead. "I'm going to go through with it, against my better judgment," Kale said, looking Zorian straight in the eye. "I guess I should congratulate you. It's been a while since Kana so obviously wanted something. Now hurry up and explain things before I change my mind." "Fine," Zorian shrugged. "I'll keep it brief. There are 6 transformation potions here, all identical. Drink it and you will be transformed into a peregrine falcon. And then we can fly." Kirill asked excitedly. "Of course," Zorian said. "What would be the point of transforming into a bird if you can't fly? Though it might take a while before you can control your new body correctly, so don't be surprised if your initial attempts turn poorly." "What if someone falls from the sky for some reason?" Amaya asked. "Or if something tries to eat us?" "That's why there are 6 potions instead of 7, Zack noted. "I'll remain untransformed and step in if someone messes up. As for something trying to eat you, well, it shouldn't happen. But if it does, Zorian will be flying beside you and give them hell. There is nothing in the area that can survive against him. Mostly because of his psychic powers. For normal mages, transforming into a non-humanoid form was quite risky, as they would lose access to all structured spells. Zorian's mental powers were just as usable as a falcon as they were when he was human, so he was not nearly as defenseless. Okay. It's comforting to know you've put some thought into this and that it isn't something you're doing on a whim, Imaya said. But isn't this horribly expensive? Don't get me wrong, I'd like to try being a falcon as much as the others, but it just seems so wasteful to spend all these potions for what is essentially playing around. Ah, yes, Imaya was the only adult here that hadn't been informed about the time loop. One of these days he was going to tell her the truth just to see how she reacted. He spent a few seconds trying to put together a convincing response in his head, but before he could vocalize it, Taven already butted in to explain instead. Don't worry about that, Taven sighed. It's secret, so I can't tell you the details, but the cost of these potions is so small for these two as to be functionally irrelevant. A few more clarifications later and the potions were distributed to everyone present except Zack. Originally Zorian intended to drink his potion first to reassure the others that it worked correctly, but apparently Kiriel didn't need convincing and immediately drank hers when Zorian handed a bottle to her. She transformed without any issues and the rest of them were treated to a sight of a brand new female falcon flailing around on the grass for a good minute or so. She had attempted to take flight immediately and found that it was not nearly as easy as one might think. After that the rest of them drank the potion and transformed as well. The next several hours were kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, nobody ended up getting hurt. On the other hand, it turned out that Zorian had vastly underestimated how difficult it was to control a completely alien body for most people. He had thought that his initial attempts at being a bird were bad, but he was like a born genius compared to what his current pupils displayed. After some thoughts, he came to the conclusion that this was probably another thing that benefited from him being open, as Arania would call it. The entire point of his psychic ability was that it gave him greater awareness of his own mind and allowed him to process mental information from completely foreign sources. That was why he was able to contact and read other people's minds so easily, why divinations that dumped information straight into the mind of the caster worked better for him, and probably why he could handle being transformed into a completely foreign body far better than, say, Imaya or Kale. He suddenly understood a lot better why transformation magic was so relatively niche, and why shifters were still envied by those who wished to take on the forms of other creatures. Learning how to control a different body than the one you are used to was hard for Zorian, and it was apparently even harder for other people. Anyone who wanted to benefit from transformation magic couldn't do it on a whim. They had to practice with their new form a lot before they could use it in any serious manner. Still, by the time the potion wore off, everyone had managed to take flight at least once. This was mostly because Zorian was present, though. He used his telepathy to directly show people how a falcon is supposed to move, sometimes even puppeteering their movements for a few seconds to demonstrate what they were doing wrong. If they had been trying this alone, chances are they would have required at least 3 or 4 sessions to get that right. And it was entirely possible they would have ended up hurting themselves in the process. The common consensus at the end was that being a falcon and flying through the air under their own power was amazing and that maybe they should do it again sometime. Kiriel also excitedly floated the idea of turning into a dragon next time. He probably spooked Imaya and Kale something fierce when he didn't immediately veto the idea. Break, what are you doing? Zorian stopped drawing the bowl of fruit in front of him to give Kiriel a strange look. Isn't it obvious? Zorian asked. I'm drawing things. Zorian didn't really know why he was doing it, to be honest. He didn't think himself an artist, but he felt like trying a new hobby since his old one of reading fiction was starting to get a little stale. There were only so many good stories out there and he had read just about everything that interested him at least twice by now. He would probably get bored of drawing eventually, but he had only been doing this for the past 3 restarts and for now he found it kind of relaxing. Since when do you draw? She asked, no silly sticking her head over him to study his work. Is this related to that mysterious artist of yours? For a moment, he was confused what she was talking about before he remembered that was how he had explained those old drawings of hers he had given her at the beginning of the restart. He had been steadily compiling her work over the past several restarts, giving her the updated collection in every restart. Since she disliked drawing things that already existed among the drawings given to her by Zorian, this forced her to continually pick new things to draw every time. Much like his decision to start drawing, this effort was motivated purely on the ground that he found the result kind of amusing. It was a bit wasteful in terms of mental space, but that was no longer the issue it once was. Ever since he opened the matriarch's memory packet, he had plenty of space for things like this. In addition, he had recently developed a better, more efficient method of storing notebooks than his original improvised setup. He no longer recorded the entire structure of a notebook, opting to just memorize the text and the diagrams inscribed within. A seemingly simple idea, but one that had taken him months of tinkering to get right. "Yeah, I guess it is," said Zorian. After all, it was unlikely it would occur to him to start drawing if it were not for Kirill. "Is she a girl?" Kirill asked conspiratorially. Zorian's mouth twitched in amusement. "Yes," he said with a bashful cough. "As a matter of fact, she is." Kirill grinned impishly, looking very pleased with herself for figuring it out. "I knew it," she crowed. "What's her name? Do I know her? When can I meet her? Oh, and what about?" It took Zorian at least a half an hour to get her to leave him alone, and somehow he had managed not to laugh at her face throughout the whole thing. Sometimes he really surprised himself. "Break." Zorian turned the solid iron sphere in his hands, staring at it thoughtfully. He would undoubtedly look weird and maybe kind of crazy to any passerby that might be looking at him, since the sphere was totally invisible to the naked eye. Fortunately for him, the only other person inside the room was the very person who had given him that sphere, so he could focus on the object of his study without being distracted by the mutterings of random strangers. The sphere in his hands was a complex, multi-layered thing surrounded by a dense cloud of different wards stacked upon each other. The jigsaw-like arrangement of metal plates that made up its physical structure was liberally peppered with both mechanical triggers and glyph clusters that would destroy the fragile core buried in the heart of the sphere if he tried to open it incorrectly. He was supposed to retrieve said core whole and intact, so that was obviously an unacceptable outcome. He had to navigate the virtual maze of stacked wards and then carefully dismantle the sphere to retrieve the core hidden within. And he had to do it without being able to see what he was working with, since the invisibility field was tied to the very core he was supposed to retrieve and couldn't be deactivated until he got access to it. Oh well, time to get to work. The sphere's invisibility was a pain, but it didn't leave Zorian stumped. His magic perception had been steadily advancing ever since Xvim had introduced him to the skill, and recently he had undergone several giant leaps forwards in that regard. Partially this was due to the augmentation potions made from the Grey Hunter's corpse, and partially it was because he and Zack had been throwing obscene amounts of money at various experts so they would teach them their skills. He focused his senses on the sphere, trying to make sense of it. After about 10 minutes of passive observation he was confident enough to move on to more active methods. He carefully analyzed the contraption with a multitude of divinations, some general and some incredibly focused and specific. Slowly he bypassed or neutralized the outer wards so he could start dismantling the physical structure of the sphere. It took him more than 2 hours of challenging work, but he was successful in the end. He held a bright red crystal in his hand and handed it to the middle-aged bearded man that had been watching him as he worked. "Excellent. Excellent," the man said happily. "That was truly impressive. You're even better than your brother was at your age." Zorian smiled at the compliment, not saying anything. His outrage at being constantly compared to Damon had cooled down considerably over the years, but he didn't trust himself not to sound bitter if he tried to respond with words. He would just nod and quietly take advantage of the fact that this man had taught his brother and looked at him favorably because of it. "I couldn't help but notice that you didn't use a divination compass while you worked," the man said, leaning back in his chair. "Do you not need it?" "No," Zorian said honestly. "I just dump all the information the spells give me directly into my head. I'm innately talented at interpreting that, so there is no need to bother with a divination compass. Besides, I find that most physical tools discard a lot of important information given by the divination, simply because they have no way of displaying it. Ha! Of course they do, that's why word breakers like us pay huge sums for ever more sophisticated divination compasses. In my estimation, you are already at the level where generic, store-bought crap can't satisfy your needs. You'd have to contact a Mana Forge and buy a custom-built one. Of course, if you're really capable of comprehending the spells in your mind, maybe that's just pointless cost for you, I don't know. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. He was honest about not needing a divination compass, but he supposed it wouldn't hurt to check out the fancier, custom-built ones. Who knows, maybe there was something he was missing with his current methods. It cost him nothing to buy a box of them and then dismantle them to see how they worked. A few hours later he left, carrying a list of divination compass makers and a letter of recommendation without which those high-level experts wouldn't even deign to speak with him. He soon arrived at the local park where Zack was already waiting for him, sitting on the bench and feeding the pigeons with bread like some old pensioner. "Already done?" Zorian asked, mildly surprised. Zack was supposed to check out the combat magic instructors in the city, which should have taken him a lot longer than this. "None of them are worth our time," Zack said, shaking his head and throwing another chunk of bread at the small throng of pigeons in front of him. "Larsa is Falkrinia's biggest and most important city. You'd think they'd have a respectable selection of combat instructors, but they're nothing special. I guess it's true what they say about Falkrinia being the weakest of the big three in terms of military might." Zorian nodded, accepting his judgment. Zack had spent decades in the time loop pursuing combat magic excellence, so he knew what he was talking about. Even though Zorian required a completely different selection of spells to be an effective combat mage than Zack did, he had faith that Zack was keeping that fact in mind when checking these people out. He plopped down on the bench next to Zack, marveling at the way the pigeons failed to react to his sudden movement. If these pigeons ever landed in Surin, they would be all caught before nightfall and barbecued. Say what you want about Falkrinia's lack of military might, they really were a prosperous nation. "What do you think about your newest instructor?" Zack asked. "Is he any good?" "He's good," Zorian nodded slowly. "But?" Zack asked, sensing there was more to it. "He's not teaching me everything he's got," Zorian sighed. "And I don't think there's a way to convince him to do so. He's very impressed with me, but he'll only teach his best secrets to a formal apprentice, and even then you'd have to stay with him for a year or more before he would consider it," guessed Zack. "Something like that," Zorian nodded. "That's pretty much what Xvim said would happen," Zack noted. "You never did go around mind-probing people on that list, did you?" "No, I had been contacting them and trying to get them to teach me their skills the proper way. I had been hoping it won't be necessary," Zorian said, frowning. "And in a way it really hadn't been, if only because up until now I had plenty of worthwhile things to learn even without resorting to that. But now, I don't know. If we want to get at the dagger and the royal treasury, we're going to need to become a lot better at ward breaking and the like. And these are not skills that people are willing to trust a stranger with, especially not one they've met less than a month ago. These are highly restricted, sometimes outright illegal skills. Most of the experts I've been talking to won't even admit they have them, much less agree to teach them to us." He hadn't been met with total failure. Two of the experts on Xvim's list actually proved willing to teach him to the best of their ability, one because he happened to be in debt and was desperate for large sums of money, and one because he was a mind mage who found Zorian's innate mental abilities endlessly fascinating. It was kind of interesting to compare structured mind magic to his own abilities and see how they fare against each other, and though he was unlikely to ever use structured mind magic himself, it did inspire him to take his mental abilities in new directions. However, just two experts out of the large list Xvim had given him was, well, frustrating. Especially since it wasn't just a moral issue, it was so much more useful to learn from people when they were honestly trying to teach you something. Because of the need to know which are the right questions to ask and a lack of back and forth between the teacher and the student, mind magic interrogations were far inferior to having a willing teacher. If Zorian had to memory probe Xvim every time he wanted something from him, for instance, the benefits would be but a fraction of what he got out of the man through his current methods. Well, unless Xvim was secretly hiding something of crucial importance from him, but Zorian kind of doubted that. What about targeting criminals? Zack asked. You've established links with Sioria's criminal underground through the contact list the area left behind, haven't you? Yes, he certainly had. Interestingly, most of these were not cloaked, shady men in dark alleys, but rather otherwise respected merchants and somewhat less respected mercenaries. He had used his mind magic on these people a lot more freely than he had when interacting with legitimate experts and instructors, but truthfully, there was a reason why most of these people used their abilities for crime instead of opening a legitimate business. They just weren't good enough. Most of them had a neat trick or two, and Zorian copied those from them when he could, but in general they had nothing that couldn't be acquired easier elsewhere. Probably the most useful thing he obtained from these people was a channel for acquiring illegal materials and the knowledge of how to hire unscrupulous mercenaries without getting ripped off or ending up in jail. Useful things to be sure, but that wasn't what Zack was asking about. It wouldn't work, Zorian said simply, shaking his head. They don't have what we need. All right, Zack said, not pressing the issue. To be perfectly honest, I think we are doing just fine as it is. You shouldn't feel pressured to do this if you don't want to. We'll manage somehow. Zorian said nothing to that, not really sure himself what the correct answer was. There was a part of him that said he was being stupid by refusing to employ his mental abilities to their maximum extent, but he suspected that once he started to casually assault people for no reason other than them having things he wanted, it would be hard to take a step back. You're what you do. If he started going down that path, it would change him, and not for the better. Sure, having those skills would greatly increase the chances of him successfully escaping the time loop, but was there any point that if what came out at the end was a monster? Zorian rose from his spot and walked away. Zack followed him, throwing the entire remains of his bread to the pigeon throng as he left the bench. They left the park and its dangerously fearless pigeons and continued their conversation on foot. Underwhelming results aside, this is a nice city, Zack said. Was there anything else you wanted to do here? Yes, actually, Zorian said. There is a famous golem maker here and a couple of spell formula crafters for hire. You really are determined to spend all of our money, aren't you? Zack asked rhetorically. Of course. It's completely useless to leave it sitting there without use. It's not like we can transfer it between restarts, Zorian said. He actually wasn't going to seek instructions from these people, he was going to hire them to do work for him. He had been doing that for several restarts now, paying various spell formula experts to design or improve blueprints for him. Then he took the finished designs and gave them to the same people on the next restart in order to further refine them. Sometimes he also gave them to different people, just to see what different takes they have on the problem. He did the same with warding experts, golem makers and alchemists. All of those fields took a lot of thinking and testing, but the finished designs were fairly compact and could be used by anyone, making them really convenient to advance in this fashion. At some point he was probably going to hit a point of diminishing returns with this, but that point was a long way off at the moment. Besides, when that happened, he might be able to take the collected knowledge he gained this way and trade it to people for their professional secrets. Magical knowledge and techniques could tempt some people in a way that money never could. The snide part of Zorian informed him that he was robbing these people just as surely as a memory probe would have, only using more roundabout methods. Zorian told it to shut up and that it just wasn't the same. Break. Simulacrum number 2 was bored and the cause was easy to understand. He was attending academy classes like a normal student. Zorian hadn't been regularly attending classes for quite a while now, even when trying to stay on the teacher's good side, since doing that was a huge time sink and provided him with no benefits at this point. Unfortunately, he didn't have a choice in the matter. The original had gotten it into his head that he should check how obvious a simulacrum's disguise was by having them interact with a bunch of people on a regular basis. Which somehow meant being sent back to school. Okay, so he actually knew what the logic behind that was. He had all of the original's memories, after all. The idea was that the academy was full of mages of all sorts, and his classmates were at least passingly familiar with him, so if anyone could notice there was something wrong with him, it would be them. They didn't notice anything wrong, of course. The simulacrum actually broke off from the script entirely. He was supposed to stay inconspicuous, but he decided to show off his future knowledge as much as possible instead, and nobody raised a fuss. Unlike Zack, he was known to be a good, diligent student. They probably thought he had studied ahead or something. In any case, the mission was less one of nerve-wracking infiltration and more of an exercise in resisting soul-crushing boredom. The only good thing about the situation was that he would only have to tolerate this for one day. The original had been very zealous about dismissing his simulacrums at the end of each day, so he wouldn't have to be here tomorrow too. Why couldn't he have been like the simulacrum number 1, who was mapping the local underworld, or simulacrum number 3, who was arranging a trade deal with one of the Iranian webs near Nyazoft Vary? Well, the current class had finally ended during his internal whining, so he could. Wow, Zorian, you got every question on that unannounced test correctly. How did you do that? I checked and some of those questions aren't even in our textbook. Zorian turned around in his seat, looking at the girl speaking with him. It was Nilu. When he had arrived to the academy, he had quickly realized that she considered him to be something of a friend, even though he had no memory of ever really interacting with her before the time loop. How was that possible? Well, he wasn't the first simulacrum that was sent on this mission. And apparently one of the previous simulacrums was similarly bored out of his skull here and decided to go off the script and befriend her. And then never bothered to inform the original about it. Simulacrum number 2 didn't intend to inform the original either. The whole thing was harmless, and imagining the original's reaction when he finally found out was kind of amusing. He leaned forward a little in a conspiratorial manner and motioned for Nilu to come closer. She did, and from the corner of his eyes he also saw Koya leaned in a little so she could eavesdrop on them better. "I have a time machine," he whispered to her solemnly. "And I'm using it to cheat at school." He heard Koya snort softly in the background. Nilu, though, gave him a weird, considering look. "Really?" she asked suspiciously, like he had just told her something unlikely but still entirely possible. That was not the response the simulacrum had expected. He stared at her face for a second, at a loss about how to answer that. Now that he thought about it, Nilu was a bit cute. She had a pretty face, and her naivete could be kind of endearing, in small doses. He had looked down on her in the past, thinking she was kind of dim and flighty, so he had never really thought about it much. But seeing how he was going to live less than a day now, he found himself a lot more forgiving than he would usually be. "No, I was just joking with you. I don't really have a time machine," Zorian explained patiently. "Pity. Having a time machine would be grand," Nilu said, smiling. "Sometimes I really wish I could go back in time and fix things before I mess up." "Don't we all?" Zorian shrugged. "Too bad the time loop didn't work like that." After a bit of thought he tore off a sheet of paper from his notebook and wrote down the questions for tomorrow's spell formula test and handed it to Nilu. The moment she realized what she was looking at, her eyes widened comically. "Is this?" she began, only for Zorian to cut her off. "Hush. I never handed you anything, okay? See you tomorrow, I guess." Akoya gave him a very disapproving look afterwards. Apparently she figured out the general nature of what he did from the clues in front of her and she didn't like it. Her disapproval died down considerably when he handed her a copy of the questions as well, though she did mumble something about cheating being wrong. The simulacrum rolled his eyes at the statement and went back to Amayu's place to report to the original. Somehow, he didn't think that would actually stop her from making use of the information tomorrow. Break. 8 restarts had passed since the time Zack and Zorian had first tried to break into El Raymar's royal treasury. Their priorities during this time consisted of investigating the invasion forces, looking for possible signs of Red Robe, trying to track down the rest of the missing key pieces and figuring out some way to leave the time loop. Of course, since actually retrieving even the known pieces of the key was impossible with their current skills, and they had no idea what kind of abilities they would need to retrieve the rest, a large portion of their efforts was dedicated to elevating their magical expertise in various ways. Zack did his best to focus on strengthening his personal soul awareness and mental defenses, but both of those skills were very tedious to improve, and Zack was pretty impatient by nature. He often spent a lot of time trying to figure out some way to improve his combat magic, even though he was already very good at that, and any improvements tended to be very marginal. As for Zorian, he did a little bit of everything, from pursuing more mind magic lessons from the area, though he had picked all low-hanging fruit in that regard and was starting to hit the point of diminishing returns, to working on his golems and magic skill. However, the bulk of his efforts centered around mastering dimensionalism and time magic as much as possible, in the hopes that doing so would give him some clue as to how they could escape the time loop. Thus far, he didn't have any solid leads in regards to such an escape route, but he did learn how to open dimensional gates and haste himself, so at least he accomplished something. Currently, Zack and Zorian were inside a black room, but not the same black room as the one in Seoria. This was the result of a considerable effort to find other black rooms across Altasia, since making use of the one in Seoria twice remained as impractical as ever. So far they had managed to find two more, one in Salemnon and the other in Quanyar, a small splinter state on the border of Eldamar. Unfortunately, these were a lot less impressive than the one Eldamar had built. The Salemnese one could only be activated for 12 days, while the Quanyari one could only last for 5. But still, 17 days was 17 days, and Zack and Zorian had been dutifully making use of them anyway. It might actually be a good thing that these black rooms were less effective than the Seorian one, since suffering through 3 months of isolation in every restart would probably be really unhealthy for their psyche. Especially considering Zack was already going crazy, even though they were currently in the Quanyari black room and there was only 1 day left before they could leave. Damn it. Zack swore, the complicated geometric shape above his hand winking out as he lost control of it. Lately he had been trying out some very exotic shaping exercises and another bit for improving his combat magic, but evidently it wasn't going as well as he hoped. Okay, I've had enough of this. Done. I'm done. He shouted this over-dramatically to the sky, well, to the ceiling, since they were indoors, while keeping his hands raised in the air. Somehow, Zorian was getting the idea that there was more to this than his momentary failure to figure out a random shaping exercise. You're still angry about what happened with Alanik and his soul awareness training, aren't you? He surmised. Zack responded by swearing up a storm, which Zorian took as confirmation that he was correct. It happened in the previous restart. Alanik had finally judged Zack to have reached a point in his soul awareness where he could move on to the more dangerous version of soul training that Zorian had undergone. Zack was very excited and confident, but the moment Alanik touched Zack and tried to separate his soul from his body, Zorian's marker activated and the restart immediately ended. The marker woven through their souls was a curious thing. It was hard to figure out for the same reason that memory probes were hard. You had to pretty much already know what you were looking for before you could find it. You couldn't just browse through it for interesting information like you would a book and the like. You had to know which was the right question to ask. Now armed with the knowledge of what was possible, courtesy of what he had seen his own marker do in that terminated restart, Zorian had no problems leveraging his hard-won soul awareness into figuring out what happened. The marker, as it turned out, had a contingency that terminated the current restart if significant tampering of the controller's mind or soul is detected. It was unclear what exactly would qualify as significant tampering, but apparently even wrenching a soul out of the controller's body was enough to trigger it. In Zorian's marker, this function was non-functional, which was why he could go through Alanik's soul training without any issues. Zack's marker, however, was not defective in this manner. It detected Alanik's training as an attack upon the controller and reacted accordingly. This information helped answer a few questions that Zorian had been wondering about for quite some time. such as why Red Robe had done such relatively minor damage to Zack's memories. He probably couldn't have done more than he did. In fact, the real surprise was that he had managed to do as much as he had without triggering the restart. If Zorian was reading his own defective marker correctly, the contingency in question was quite trigger-happy. Whoever made it was a big believer in the better safe than sorry school of philosophy when it came to the safety of the controller. Red Robe must have spent multiple restarts figuring out a way to get past it to the extent that he did. This would also explain why Zack had been so relatively unconcerned in the past about having his solar mine targeted. He had probably been hit by spells like that plenty of times, but that just ended his current restart prematurely. With that in mind, his attitude might not have been as foolish as Zorian had thought it was. Of course, no defense was unbeatable in the end. Lacays, for instance, commonly possessed a very similar contingency that wrenched their soul back to their phylactery when exposed to things like hostile soul magic. Which was how Kotachichel, as someone who had probably fought quite a few rival lacays, instantly knew how to bypass it when Zack foolishly told him he would survive bodily destruction. As for how Red Robe bypassed its protection to mess with Zack's mind, Zorian wasn't quite sure. But he had a suspicion it was related to Red Robe's use of non-structured mind magic. He distinctly remembered that Red Robe had been using non-structured mind magic on both him and Zack, despite being fairly bad at it. Which was kind of foolish of him at the face of it, since structured mind magic would have probably served a non-psychic like him a lot better in most regards. However, if the marker's contingency was aimed primarily at countering structured magic, and non-structured magic bypassed it to some extent, his choice of attack mode made perfect sense. At first, the idea that the marker's maker didn't take non-structured magic fully into account when designing the contingencies sounded like an unbelievable oversight to Zorian. However, the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Non-structured magic was a lot rarer in the past, both due to the more primitive shaping instruction at that time and because magical bloodlines used to be smaller and less sophisticated. The marker, and even the time loop itself, may have been built with a set of assumptions that were simply not valid today as they once had been. And whoever had activated the Sovereign Gate either couldn't or wouldn't update it to take modern circumstances into account. All the time I wasted on those exercises. Zack shouted, his rant finally dying down as his anger ran out of steam. It's not that bad, Zorian assured him. Yes, you lost out a fair bit by not being able to go through the same training I did, but you still managed to achieve some elementary soul awareness, and that's not nothing. It will allow you to cast defensive spells on your soul, at the very least. Which is a must if we ever want to fight Kotachichel and take his crown. So you didn't waste anything. The only real loss is that we lost an entire restart to that. Zack winced. Yeah, in retrospect, we really shouldn't have tried that at the very beginning of the restart. Hindsight is always perfect, Zorian shrugged. It's just one restart and we learned very valuable information from it. We'll manage. Zack sighed and plopped down on the floor again with a heavy grunt. He was quiet for a moment. It just seems like we haven't accomplished all that much in these past 7 months or so, you know? He finally said. I mean, we investigated all the high-ranking members of the cult and none of them are obviously Red Robe. We also can't locate Vayers at all, it's like he just vanished into thin air. We have yet to successfully extract the damn dagger from the royal treasury and we can't even find the rest of the key pieces. Okay, that last one isn't really true, Zorian said, interrupting him. We may not know their exact location, but we do know where to look for them. Their search for the missing pieces of the key had been long and expensive. Such a project would have been impossible to finish in any reasonable amount of time by just 2 of them working alone. So they didn't even try. They outsourced their work to numerous information brokers, both legal and criminal, paying huge sums to have them and their agents check up on rumors and stories of Ecosian inheritance floating around. They hired museums and historians to comb through historical records in search of any scrap of information related to the objects. As for themselves, they made themselves useful by breaking into government records of Eldamar, Salamnon, Falkirenia and other splinter states. The buildings that held those records were not nearly as well defended as the royal treasury, and the splinter states had made their own attempts to locate these important historical objects. Thankfully, those efforts were not without results. Knowing that one of the pieces is in the deepest part of the Xlotic desert, that another had been lost gods nowhere in the jungles of Koth, and that the last one was stolen by some asshole who took it with him to Blantyre is not very helpful, Zack crouched. All it tells us is that searching for the rest of the key on Altasia is probably pointless. And how are we supposed to get to these places to search for the missing pieces, anyway? Just getting to Koth would take us almost an entire restart, never mind actually searching for it. If that information is true, we're kind of screwed, Zorian. Maybe, Zorian agreed. But you see, I have a plan. Chapter 064 Distance. Eldamar and Koth were very far from one another. The exact distance was hard to pin down, since the name Koth covered a pretty big area on the southern continent, but Zorian estimated it to be around 7,000 kilometers minimum. Worse, this was a straight-line distance, so the actual journey would be even longer. It was not impossible to make that journey in the span of a month, but just reaching the place was not enough for Zack and Zorian. They needed to reach it with plenty of time to spare, or else they would have no time to search for the piece of the key that was supposedly lost there. Additionally, if they spent most of their time in transit to Koth, they could not make use of the black rooms scattered across Altasia. Thus, by committing themselves to such a journey, they effectively lost more than a single month of time. There were two main methods of traveling from Eldamar to Koth. The simplest, as well as the cheapest method was to board a ship at the city of Luya and make your way to Koth by sea. Even the cheaper ships would get you there within a month, and the pricier vessel may make the journey in as little as 20 days. Well, assuming the ship didn't get sunk by a tiger-striped Nautilus or something along the way. But he heard those were pretty much exterminated along major shipping routes, along with sea hydras, razor sharks and flying barracudas, so probably not. In any case, this was the method Zorian's parents were using to get to Koth, as they were not in that much of a hurry and didn't want to spend more money than they needed to. The second main method was utilizing the existing network of teleport platforms that connected most major settlements on Altasia and Myasina. It was pricier than ship travel, but that was not an issue for Zack and Zorian. A bigger problem was that while this method was faster than ship travel, it actually wasn't that much faster. Using publicly available information, Zorian calculated that it would take them 15 days to reach Koth by using the teleport platform network, and that was under ideal conditions. The issue was that the teleport platform network worked on a strict schedule that couldn't be sped up. The network spanned over numerous different countries, after all, and none of them were willing to let mass teleport traffic go in and out of the country with no control or supervision. Each platform had security checks and border control that travelers had to go through, and that took time. A lot of time. According to Zack, he had already tried to use the platforms as a method of reaching Koth once, purely on a whim, and it actually took him most of the month to reach his destination. Would Zorian be able to do better? Doubtful. Even if Zorian offered to pay extra, the teleport operators would refuse to make an off-schedule platform activation just for his sake, who would cause an international incident just for some extra cash. And even if Zorian went wild with his mind magic and convinced them to make an exception for him and Zack, the destination platform security would not be inclined to play along. Depending on the destination, they might even shoot him on sight. There had been cases where teleport platforms were used for raids and surprise attacks, and some places were very trigger-happy about unannounced teleports. All in all, Zorian didn't think he could optimize the teleport platform to any significant extent. They were a very fast and convenient method if one was traveling to a destination that was a couple of jumps away, but they just weren't designed to get people over vast distances as fast as they were willing to pay. If anything, the speed of transit was deliberately throttled to more manageable levels, so that the local authorities could exercise some measure of control over it. Unfortunately, there were no other routine methods for crossing such large distances. Not many absurdly rich people needed to get from Eldamar to Koth as fast as humanly possible in any given year, so no widespread service provided it. That left unconventional methods. Zorian had considered some wild ones, such as stealing one of the few existing airships to make the journey or transforming into a migratory bird and flying there, but ultimately dismissed them as too fanciful to really work. Besides, methods like that didn't solve the problem of losing access to Altasia's black rooms, and would require them to dedicate at least several restarts in pursuit of exotic skills that were unlikely to be useful for anything else. Being able to pilot an airship was good for bragging rights and not much else, unless you were actually an airship pilot by trade. Eventually, his thoughts turned to the gate spell and his recent practice of making heavy use of simulacrums. Probably because that was what he had been working on recently. By themselves, neither of the two spells was the solution to his problem. But combined together, they could be. The simulacrum had no range limit as far as Zorian was aware. It had to be created next to the caster, but it could then roam as far away from the original as it wanted. The gate spell, on the other hand, was largely limited by its rather miserable range. Unless there were people on both ends of the gate working in tandem to stabilize it. If there were people casting the spell on both ends of the gate, then it also didn't have a known range limit. In practice, the gate spell was rarely utilized in this way, both because people capable of casting the gate spell were as rare as hen's teeth and because actually coordinating two such people to synchronize their casting over large distances was hard. It was often quicker and more practical to simply chain teleports from place to place than to go through such a hassle. With the simulacrum spell, Zorian didn't have to worry about finding another person capable of casting the spell. He could effectively be two or more people at the same time. And while coordinating the spell over continental distances was a bit of an issue, it was not insurmountable. In the worst case, he could simply instruct his simulacrum to leave a trail of telepathic relays along its path and maintain contact that way. One nice thing about the idea was that while his simulacrum was traveling to Koth, he would be able to stay in Eldamar and wouldn't lose access to the black rooms in that particular restart. One not-so-nice thing was that this would permanently tie down one of his simulacrums, leaving one less for him to boss around. He could only maintain 3 simulacrums at most without his mana regeneration going negative, so that was not an entirely irrelevant cost. Additionally, that would require him to discard his previous rule about only allowing simulacrums to exist for 24 hours. However, he didn't really foresee much problems with that. His simulacrums had been really well behaved, all things considered. His current simulacrums could be kind of cranky and weird sometimes, but they were clearly him and had his best interests at heart. Still, maybe he should start considering some kind of countermeasure in case one of his simulacrums went rogue and tried to take over? But any countermeasure he designed his simulacrum would know about. Arg. In any case, that still left the question of how the simulacrum was going to reach Koth in a reasonable amount of time. It was nice that Zorian wasn't going to have to dedicate half a restart to such a journey and lose access to the black rooms, but the fact remained they would only have 15 or so days in each restart left to conduct a search for the key. He needed something better than that. That was why he decided to talk to the Silent Doorway Adepts. It could turn out to be a massive waste of time, but if they really knew something about the operation of Bakura gates, that could be precisely the solution he needed. After all, why bother setting up a brand new gate network if one already existed, and was largely unsupervised to boot? Thus, Zack and Zorian were currently standing in front of the Silent Doorway Adept representative, Refuge and Void. She was a skittish little thing, twitching and shuffling in place all the time, acting way too nervous for a professional negotiator. Then again, how many humans interacted with Arrhenius so heavily they learned how to read their body cues? Maybe it was Zorian who was weird. Surrounding them were 8 other Arrhenia, serving as guards. There were originally 4 of them, but the Silent Doorway Adepts brought in another 4 once they realized what Zack and Zorian were after. The negotiations weren't going too well. "I am sorry, honored guests, but we really cannot help you with this," the silent doorway adept representative said, using a vocalization spell to speak out loud instead of resorting to their usual telepathy. She was either not very proficient in the spell or was trying to unnerve them with amateurish psychological warfare, because her voice was weirdly resonant and distorted. The Bakura Gate in our possession is simply a treasured historical artifact. It has great sentimental value to us, but we know of no method to actually make it work. Her middle legs twitched slightly, an obvious nervous tic that plagued her since the very beginning of these talks. But please, she added, trying her best to sound sincere, if you find anything regarding the activation of Bakura Gates, contact us immediately. We are as interested in this matter as you are. I'm sure you are, said Zorian, clacking his tongue unhappily. They had tried just about everything they could think of to secure the web's cooperation on this. They had offered confidential information on surrounding polities, offered rare materials and money, offered knowledge of secret Iranian techniques they had gotten from the other webs in various restarts, and they had offered an utterly ridiculous amount of crystallized mana for it. It was all for naught. The silent doorway adepts remained obstinate in feigning ignorance on the matter. He exchanged a long look with Zack, who just shrugged in response. This meeting was largely Zorian's idea. Zack came to the meeting while under the effects of the mind-blank spell and mostly remained silent, a fact that surely wasn't helping the silent doorway adepts relax around them. Still, that was the whole point. Zorian deliberately instructed Zack to do that, as an unspoken intimidation attempt. He knew from his past dealings with the silent doorway adepts that merely being polite and generous wasn't going to accomplish anything, so he brought Zack along to show them he wasn't someone they could dismiss out of hand. In a way, it worked. Zorian was sure the web would have chased him off by now if he had come alone, but since there was a mind-blank witch standing next to him, looking all grim and imposing, they remained polite and treated him far nicer than they did in the past. It was true, what they say, negotiations tended to go better if you brought both gifts and an armed entourage, as opposed to just gifts. Unfortunately, their hosts seemed to be running out of patience, as Zorian spotted some of the guards shifting their positions, as if preparing themselves for a surprise attack. "Please don't do that," he said with a sigh. "You have no chance against us in an actual fight. I'm sure you've noticed that my friend here is under a mind blank, and I assure you he's as good as you'd think. I am not that bad at fighting myself, if you'll permit me to be a little immodest, so don't discount me as a threat either. You would only be walking into your death if you attack us. Don't do this to yourself. If you are so confident in your combat prowess, why not just attack us and take what you want by force?" Refuge and Void said. Perhaps it was just Zorian, but she sounded a little bitter to him. "Why negotiate with us at all?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Zorian told her matter-of-factly. "We're not brigands." "I see. So your friend here?" she asked, leaning slightly towards Zack, who raised his eyebrow at her curiously. "It's just a precaution," Zorian said. "Unless you attack me, this meeting will not degenerate into violence." Also, he was not at all sure he could figure out their secrets from reading their minds. The sort of knowledge about the gate he wanted was likely held by a small selection of their experts and maybe leaders, and they were liable to have protected it well. In the past, when Zack and Zorian raided Iranian webs, their elders had the annoying tendency to erase their own memories in regards to important secrets, rather than let them fall into their hands. Since the two of them hadn't been after their closest secrets back then, this had been a minor matter back then. Now, though, it would be a giant showstopper. "In that case, I will be frank with you, we are not willing to divulge our secrets to you," Refuge and Void said. "You're just wasting both of our time here." "At any price?" Zorian frowned. "I'm afraid so. I honestly can't think of anything you could offer us that would make us reveal our closest mysteries to you." Well, this was not unexpected. It was time to bring out his secret weapon, then. "Let's test this with one last offer, then," Zorian said. "Sure," Refuge and Void said, projecting a mixture of relief and disinterest, as if she was just pleased this was about to end. "Me and Zack here are time travelers," Zorian said. And we can help you send messages from your current selves to the silent doorway adepts in the past. There was a short pause as the Iranian representative froze for a second and then shook her forward legs in a strange gesture. Well, she said. I have to say, this is the first time anyone has tried that argument. I find myself curious. Do you have any kind of proof for that statement? 3 days from now, you are going to send a team of 3 Arania to an old contact in Tozan to pick up another shipment of crystallized mana, said Zorian, causing the representative to freeze again. However, it will be a trap and 2 of them will never return. That doesn't dash. Refuge and Void started saying. 2 days after that, continued Zorian in a louder voice, cutting her off, you will finally track down the red scrolls at Millicent, but your previous buyer will say he's no longer interested in them. He will instead point you to Padina's magical museum as a possible buyer. At the same time, you will come into possession of a box of Emberheart crystals. After Zorian made another 10 or so predictions, Refuge and Void finally broke down and went to speak with her elders. An hour later, he was handed over to someone higher in the chain of command, specifically, Glittering River of Stars, who was some kind of vice-elder as far as he could figure out. She was a lot less obstructive than Refuge and Void had been, but still not willing to talk to him about Bakura Gates. We will need some time to confirm these predictions of yours. I'm sure you understand, Glittering River said apologetically. She really sounded apologetic, too. She was a much better actor than Refuge and Void had been. I understand, Zorian said, nodding slowly. It's fine. We didn't really expect to get your cooperation after one attempt, anyway. But that's okay, Zack said with a sunny smile. We have as many attempts to get this right as we want to. To her credit, Glittering River did not shift her twitch uncomfortably, as Refuge and Void had been prone to, but Zorian could tell she was uncomfortable anyway. They had explained to her the general nature of the time loop they were in, but neglected to mention some important details, such as that they were on a time limit or just how crucial Bakura Gate information might be to them. Zorian wasn't sure how much the silent doorway adepts really believed about their story, but they were clearly spooked enough by the implications to humor him for a bit. Incidentally, if there is a way for me to prove my claims easier to your web in future restarts, I'd love to hear it, Zorian said. We will have to discuss things before I get back to you on that, Glittering River said diplomatically. After that, they were basically ejected out of the colony and told to come back in a week. Considering that Zorian had been afraid they would laugh them straight out of the room the moment they mentioned time travel, he considered this already a victory. So long as they didn't reject the idea out of hand, he was sure they could prove to them that the time loop was real. They may not have literally infinite retreats like they had implied to Glittering River, but what they did have should be more than enough. We seem to have frightened them pretty badly there, Zack commented on the way back to Seoria. Especially when you started mentioning the deals you've made with other webs and how you intend to repay them after you get out of the time loop. You'd think they'd be happy about their fellow webs being rewarded, but apparently not. The last time one of the Iranian webs got massively superior to others, they swept over the entire continent, conquering or supplanting every rival colony in the way, Zorian pointed out. They've got every right to be worried. Huh? I hadn't thought of it that way, Zack said thoughtfully. I mean, you've already told me that, but I just hadn't considered how that would affect their attitudes. It's good I left the negotiations mostly to you, then. You really understand Iranian psychology way better than I do. There was a short silence before Zack spoke again. So, do you really intend to just hand down knowledge to other webs like that? He asked curiously. Of course, Zorian nodded. Not to every single web I interacted with, admittedly, but every web that has been especially helpful to me is bound to get something for their trouble. What about help of the human variety? Zack asked. Do they get any repayment? That's a bit more dangerous, since they are far more likely to track me down through my gifts than the Arania. I want to pay people back for their help, but I don't want to suffer just because I have a sense of honor, said Zorian. Yeah, some people are really shameless, Zack agreed. Give them a finger and they'll try to bite off the whole arm. And some might just be too curious for their own good. Yeah, Zorian nodded. I intend to try and repay people anyway, but I'll have to be a lot more careful and selective about it. Makes me feel a little guilty, Zack admitted. I don't think I've ever seriously considered paying people back for things I got from them over the restarts. Invite me when you start finalizing those plans, okay? I think I have a few people I should really reward somehow for all the good they've done to me. Sure, Zorian nodded. So, Zack continued. The Silent Doorway Adepts. Do you think their leadership will believe us in the end? Maybe. But even if they do, it's no guarantee that they'll agree to a trade, Zorian said, shaking his head sadly. If they're paranoid enough, any deal with us might seem like shooting themselves in the foot. They have no way to make sure we're actually going to keep our end of the bargain once we're outside the time loop. Who's to say we won't just pump them for every secret they have and then unceremoniously discard them? You know, like the ghost serpent thought we would do to it. Zack made a sour face. He didn't like to be reminded of the snake spirit. He had been severely insulted by its accusations, taking them much more personally than Zorian himself did. In any case, Zorian continued, even if these negotiations fail, it's not the end of the world. There is at least one other group that seems to have insight into how Bakura gates work. There is a fully functional gate mechanism beneath Cioria, courtesy of the invaders, and it's supposed to be heavily inspired by Bakura gates. None of the Ibisons know how that thing works, pointed out Zack. I bet only Quitachichil really does. So that doesn't really help us much. Yeah, probably, Zorian agreed. He had delved into the minds of enough high-ranking invaders to realize that the gates probably weren't made by any of them. Either Quitachichil was the only one who knew the secrets of their construction, or the other builders weren't allowed to be part of the invasion force. It would make sense if it were so. The gates were one huge advantage for the Ibisons, and they definitely didn't want that secret to fall into the hands of Aldamar's mages. But I wasn't thinking of finding someone to memory probe for the information. I was thinking of simply taking over the gate site and analyzing the gate scaffolding itself. Zack raised an eyebrow at him. I thought you said that would take months, he asked curiously. Maybe years. What changed? I realized I was being kind of an idiot, Zorian said. Sure, it would take a long time if I tried to figure it out all alone. But why do that? Why not bring a small army of experts down there and have us all tackle it together? Zack hummed thoughtfully. It would have to be done very, very carefully, unless we want Quitachichil to come crashing to the party, he said. But then again, that's true for anything involving the invasion, isn't it? Yeah, it's worth a try. Let's do it. We'll wait for the day of the invasion, Zorian said hurriedly. He could see Zack was getting fired up and he would rather not go get himself killed in the middle of the restart due to his impatience. The security of the gate is laughable if you time things right. Oh, right, you did mention that, Zack said, deflating a little. Man, I feel so angry at myself for never figuring that out before you told me. I never did manage to step through the gate myself, you know? Even when I was fast enough in carving my way through the defenders to avoid Quitachichil showing up to get rid of me, the defenders always collapsed the gate before I reached it. I still can't believe you just made a direct, frontal assault on the Ibison base instead of trying to infiltrate it, Zorian said. Why the hell did you think that would work? I'm not good at infiltration, Zack said with an unrepentant shrug. Besides, it almost did work. It's not stupid if it works, right? They spent the rest of the journey home arguing about whether or not there is any difference between almost worked and ultimately failed. Break. What do you mean, I have a date with Akoya? Zorian asked his simulacrum incredulously. Just what I said, the simulacrum said, unconcerned with his agitation. She asked me to meet her in that little tea house 2 blocks from the academy and I accepted. Zorian felt the urge to throw a lightning bolt at his damn simulacrum, but he knew that wouldn't actually help him feel any better. If anything, it would just complicate things further by denying him much-needed answers as to how could this happen? You can't just decide things like this on your own. Zorian hissed to his simulacrum in frustration. The simulacrum arched his eyebrow at him. Well, it's true, Zorian insisted. I know you're my simulacrum and I told you to do whatever, but you should have contacted me for opinion before agreeing to something like this. Are you saying that if you had been in my place, you would have blown her off when she asked to meet? His simulacrum asked with a knowing smile. Zorian frowned. If this were before the time loop. Yeah, definitely. Now? No, not a chance. He wasn't interested in dating Akoya, he didn't think their personalities meshed well, but he'd give her a chance at least. He hated that goddamned smirk that was on his simulacrum's face right now, but he was right that Zorian would have likely made the same decision in his place. This is just, Zorian started, before stopping himself with a sigh. When? 2 days from now, the simulacrum said. How the hell did this happen? Zorian asked. I knew Akoya was kind of crushing on me, but she never tried anything until now. What changed? What did you do? Actually, she did set up a meeting with you once, remember? His simulacrum said. Only she chickened out at the end and nothing came of it. But I doubt it's going to be like that this time, since she set up an actual date for it and all. Anyway, I didn't do anything, it's your previous simulacrums that did. What do you mean? Zorian frowned. He'd been doing a lot of frowning ever since this conversation started. Apparently they've been pretty active among our classmates without telling you. They're hanging out with all sorts of people and then leaving out that detail when making their final reports. In particular, they've been interacting with Akoya heavily enough that she apparently felt confident enough to ask me out. Before dismissing a simulacrum, Zorian always made sure to ask it for a memory packet of everything important that had occurred to it during its short life. This was usually accompanied by a verbal report, since Zorian found it useful to chat with his simulacrums from time to time to see how they're faring. This did mean he had to rely on the simulacrums being able to effectively summarize their existence for him, but there was no real alternative. If he asked the simulacrums for memories of their entire existence, he would never be able to digest the memory packets in any reasonable amount of time. Interpreting 24 hours of memories, no matter how mundane, would take him at least a couple of hours. And he usually had more than one simulacrum active at a time. He could only rely on his simulacrums to pick what they felt was important and pass it on. Why would they do that? Zorian asked. No idea. But if I were to guess. Because it's kind of funny to imagine your reaction when you finally find out, his simulacrum said, grinning. I'm certainly amused at your predicament. My predicament, huh? Zorian said slowly, giving the simulacrum a nasty look. Actually, I have a better idea. You're going to do it. But I'm going to go away at the end of the day, the simulacrum said, confused. Not anymore, Zorian said. I've been thinking of relaxing the 24-hour rule, and you're going to be the first test subject. Congratulations, you're going to remain active for more than a day, just so you can take responsibility for what you've done. Hey, the simulacrum protested. Wait just a minute here. Don't you think it's kind of an asshole move to send the simulacrum on a date instead of you? Why? Zorian asked with a malicious smile. You're the one she spoke to, so it's only fair that you be the one to do it. Yes, well. I'm still just made of ectoplasm and we're meeting in a tea house, the simulacrum said. I'll probably be expected to drink something, and I kind of can't. I'm totally solid and homogeneous from the neck down. Huh? He didn't know that. He knew that simulacrums had to sleep just as well as he did, because he tried to leave one to work overnight once and found it snoring on the floor in the morning. As for things like food and water, he had never really thought about it. The spell description on the scroll said a simulacrum didn't need any sustenance besides magic, so he didn't think there was anything there to worry about. You know what? Zorian sighed. You're right. I should be the one going, if only for Akoya's sake. Right. I'm glad you can see reason, the simulacrum said, clearly relieved. However, Zorian added with louder voice. That doesn't mean you're completely off the hook. You remember what I said earlier? No? The simulacrum said slowly. I said I was thinking of relaxing the 24-hour rule, Zorian patiently reminded him. That still applies, and you're still going to be a test rat for that. He quickly gathered all the maps, brochures and partially filled out information tables and unceremoniously thrusted them at the simulacrum. Congratulations, Zorian said blandly. You just earned yourself a one-way ticket to Koth. Your job, which you had no option but to accept, is to find a way to cross more than 7,000 kilometers in less than a week. Good luck. Oh, come on. The simulacrum protested. That's impossible and you know it. Hey, come back here. But Zorian wasn't listening. He had less than 2 days to figure out what kind of nonsense his previous simulacrums had set up for him. Beside the current situation with Akoya, that is. Break, the small, out-of-the-way tea house Zorian and Akoya were currently in had a bit of a reputation among students. Not all of them. Before the time loop, Zorian had no idea it even existed, but among the more relationship-focused students of the academy, this place was famous as a good place for a romantic meet-up. As such, there was no doubt in Zorian's mind what Akoya was trying to say when she asked him if he wanted to meet with her here. The fact she picked this place in particular made it pretty clear she was expressing romantic interest in him. The date had gone well in Zorian's opinion. Neither Zorian nor Akoya were very talkative people, so most of the time passed in awkward silence. Still, they did chat a little, and he didn't make Akoya run off in tears or storm off angrily out of the tea house. Considering how his previous evening with Akoya had gone, this was a massive success. He gulped down the last dregs of his tea, which had gone thoroughly cold by now, and took a good look at Akoya. She looked away shyly, projecting a mixture of discomfort and excitement in response to his attention. She was a thin girl, with short brown hair and expensive-looking glasses. The clothes she wore were fancier than she usually had on her, but still very conservative and modest, all muted colors and not a bit of extra skin visible anywhere. She wasn't a classical beauty, but he'd still describe her as kind of attractive. Especially when she was blushing and being shy, like she was right now. She was so hard to figure out. Yes, she was kind of crushing on him, but he was pretty sure there was more to it than that. Out of concern for her privacy, he had refrained from peeking at her surface thoughts and limited himself to what his passive empathy was telling him. The more the date progressed, the more certain he became that she wanted to bring some topic up to his attention, but somehow she always backed down before she went through it. What was that about? He thought about calling her on it, but was reluctant to do so. Things were going pretty well thus far, so why risk ruining things? Besides, if this thing was actually important to her, she would surely summon the courage to bring it up eventually. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Akoya suddenly said, straightening herself a little. Can't I ask you something? Yes, go ahead, Zorian nodded. I know that you don't get along all that well with your family, she said, before stopping to study his reaction. Oh boy. No wonder she was so reluctant to bring this up, whatever it was. If she were to start a conversation like that with the pre-time loop Zorian, it would be treading on very dangerous waters. Now though. Well, Zorian liked to believe he had progressed a little since those days, so he just motioned her to continue. Anyway, she continued hurriedly, you kind of indicated that you want to become independent because of that. Find a high-paying job somewhere, get yourself a home and such. Zorian gave her a curious look. I was wondering if you could give me advice in that regard, she finally asked. How to achieve your own independence? Zorian asked. Yes, she confirmed quickly. Why? He asked curiously. I thought you got along great with your family. I do, she said. We're pretty close to each other and I have no problems with them. I'm fortunate that way. It's just, I don't really have a good relationship with anyone else. Zorian was about to say something before she cut him off. Except for the teachers, I know, she added, giving him a warning look. But they don't really care about the students half as much as they pretend to. Especially not students of average talents like mine, who come from a non-magical background and only have their work ethics to lean on. Zorian hummed thoughtfully, not really understanding what she was getting at. As for Akoya herself, she remained silent and thoughtful for a few seconds, and Zorian got the impression she was thinking of how to explain things further. Thus, he simply waited and refrained from interrupting her. "Did you ever get the impression that the Academy was just milking us for cash?" she finally asked. Zorian reeled back a little, caught off guard by the question. Did he think that? Well, there were plenty of things he felt they were doing wrong, but... No, not really, he admitted. Sorry. Why do you think so? Well, until the Splinter Wars and Weeping thinned out the number of noble houses and other respectable sources of students, the Sioria's Royal Academy of Magical Arts didn't even think of allowing people like us, with no prominent ancestry, into its halls. I'm pretty sure we're only here because the Academy was faced with a choice of either cutting costs or accepting riff-raff for money. And picked money in the end, of course. Ah, Zorian said. Yes, you're probably right there. But I wouldn't describe that as milking us for money personally. Maybe I'm just getting paranoid, Akoya sighed. I'm getting a bit disappointed in Academy staff these days. Anyway, the point is that I'm not sure how useful the Academy diploma is going to be for me. My family paid a lot of money for me to be here, and they expect great things from me in the future. When I had just come here, I thought that if I just tried my best in class and excelled, that it would all work out. Now I'm not so sure. And I don't want to go back to my family and beg for help. They'd help me, I know. But I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want to be a burden. So you're hoping I can give you some advice on how to find a well-paying job, affordable housing and so on, Zorian finished. Before the time loop, it was unlikely that Zorian would have been able to advise her much. At the end of the day, his idea was quite similar to her own: excel in your studies and everything would hopefully work itself out in the end. They just had a slightly different definition of what constitutes excelling. Now, though, he actually could recommend a few places to her. He had checked out the employment opportunities a couple of times, though by that point he had been severely overqualified for most of them and had abandoned the projects in disappointment. Still, he felt that it was actually smarter of her to forget about that for now and focus on excelling in her magic studies. Though perhaps in a slightly more focused manner. Just pick one field of magic and focus the bulk of your effort there, he said. I'd normally suggest spell formula, since being good at those is very well paid. But I noticed you don't like math much, so maybe not. How do you feel about alteration? It's fine, I guess, she shrugged. Try focusing on that, then, he suggested. It's one of the better paying fields. Plus, Ilsa is a master of that type of magic and she seems to like you, so you might be able to get some help out of her with that as your focus. I see, she said, looking thoughtful. Also, I'm pretty good at alteration, he noted. I might be able to give you a bit of help if you get stuck with it. Actually, he would be able to help her with just about any field of magic. But it would sound stupidly boastful to say that, so best to be a little modest about his self-praise. There was a long pause as Akoya digested all this and fiddled nervously with her teacup. So, Zorian said, ending the silence. Was this all? She mumbled, broken out of her reverie. She looked panicked for a moment. Oh. Well, yes. I guess. I see, Zorian said. That's a bit of a shame. When you asked us to meet here, I thought you were actually asking me out on a date. Well, it's not. It was part of the whole, she stammered. Relax, I'm just joking with you, he said with a light laugh. Jerk, she huffed. But, I kind of do like you. I have to be honest here, I'm not really interested in relationships right now, he told her bluntly. So long as he was stuck in the time loop, he had no intention of pursuing a relationship with anyone. I know this sounds a little heartless, but... I understand, she sighed, sagging a little. A surprisingly level-headed reaction to a rejection. Since you're being so honest, tell me straight, do I have any chance at all with you? I don't know, Zorian admitted. We're so different from each other. How so? she asked, sounding more curious than insulted. "We seem quite similar from where I'm standing." "Well, you're far more concerned about rules and reputation than I am, for one thing," Zorian said. She gave him an exasperated look. "I'd have to be blind to not notice that you don't care about propriety to the same extent I do," she said. "Yet I still like you. Surely that means I'm willing to work with you on it, right? Work with me or work on trying to change me?" Zorian wanted to ask. He could be wrong, but he got the impression that Akoya saw him less as his own person and more as raw material to turn into something more to her liking. But no, that would be too confrontational and the date would only go downward from there. So he just glossed over her question and moved on. Despite him refusing to become an item with her, the date ended pretty amiably from there. Perhaps because he didn't categorically refuse her and she still thought she might have a chance with him? Whatever the case, they agreed to meet again next week in a more neutral location, ostensibly so Zorian could give her the material he gathered about potential places of employment, costs of living in different cities and so on. He didn't know what to think of the whole thing in the end. When he heard his simulacrums had set him up on a date with Akoya, he thought this could only end badly. In his opinion, he and Akoya were very incompatible with one another. After today's meeting, though, he could almost see it working out in the end. He so didn't need this right now. Well, could be worse, he supposed. His simulacrums could have set him up with Nialu instead. He had found out that she was also someone they had befriended over the course of the current restart, for whatever reason, and a sneak peek at her thoughts told him she wasn't exactly opposed to getting involved with him. If he had ended up on a date with her, everyone in the academy would have known about it by the end of the day. At least Akoya had some sense of discretion. Thankfully, Nialu was kind of traditional in mindset, and would never ask someone out the way Akoya did. She would expect a guy to make the first move. He was going to have to supervise simulacrums he sent on boring tasks like going to class a lot closer in the future. "Break. You have got to be kidding me," simulacrum number 2 said incredulously. 500 silver coins just for a teleport to Zixia? Do you think I grow money on trees or something? The man he was talking to, a bald, heavily tattooed man in his 40s, simply scowled at him in response. "No, like, can get lost," he told Zorian in broken Ecosian. The simulacrum sighed in frustration and walked away. The original might be swimming in cash right now, but he wasn't. There was only so much money he could take with him when he left Eldamar, so he couldn't afford to be too profligate with his funds. This was especially true because every country had its own currency, so he couldn't just bring stacks of paper money to pay people with. Eldamar's paper bills weren't worth much outside Altasia. Hell, they weren't worth much in some places in Altasia, either. One of the tiny statelets he visited hated Eldamar so much he had nearly gotten attacked when he tried to pay homage with their money. No, if he wanted to complete his journey, he needed to carry things that had more universal value, gold, silver and gems. And since those things were both heavy and fairly bulky, he could only bring so much with him. Simulacrum number 2 grumbled to himself discontentedly. When he had started his journey, he was so sure he had thought of a genius solution. If the teleport platform network was too slow and inconvenient, he thought, why not just find teleport-capable mages and pay them to teleport him personally? Combined with an occasional teleport of his own when he couldn't find anyone willing to provide this service, and he felt the idea of getting to Koth in less than a week might not be so crazy after all. Well, it was a little harder than that. First of all, he had a somewhat skewed image of how common teleport-capable mages were. Especially mages that could teleport over large distances and could bring other people with them. These kind of people were very rare, and could only be reliably found in large cities and other places where mages naturally congregate. In addition, not every such mage was a heavy traveler, and often had an extremely limited selection of places they could teleport to. Finally, on top of all that, accepting Zorian's deal was technically illegal dodging of border checks. Some mages wouldn't do it at all because of it, or charged very steep prices for their services. But still, despite all these issues, the plan had been working fairly well so long as he was still traveling through Altasia. Once he entered the Shivan archipelago and the Xlotic states, though, another problem with the idea made itself known. He didn't speak the local language. Zorian knew 3 languages, the common Ecosian that was spoken throughout Altasia in various dialects, the local Kusky tongue that peasantry around Surin used in their daily lives, and the High Ecosian that was used in scholarly works and international trade. Even among mages, fluency in High Ecosian was not common. Thus, if Zorian wanted to question people for information and negotiate, he often had to resort to common Ecosian. That worked out pretty well in Altasia, but quickly became a big headache outside of it. It was true that both the Shivan archipelago and the Xlotic states were once part of the Ecosian Empire, but while these places spoke common Ecosian, this was such an alien dialect of Ecosian, at least to Zorian's ears, that he could barely understand them. Additionally, many of these places were like Zorian's own home region, in that many of the regular inhabitants spoke mainly in their own native tongue and only knew the smattering of common Ecosian for use in trade and such. The Ecosian Empire may have conquered these places and forced the Ecosian language to be used by the administration, but local languages were still there beneath it all. This was especially true in Shivan archipelago, where every damn island seemed to have its own local language and dialect. He thought that was bad. But as he traveled ever southward along the coast of Mycena, he realized this problem was only going to get worse. Kuth had never been successfully conquered by Ecosia, due to being separated from northern Mycena by a giant desert much smaller in those times, but still present, and an imposing mountain range that cut the continent nearly in half. As a consequence, they spoke completely alien tongues that Zorian couldn't understand in the slightest. On top of that, the further south he went, the darker the people's skin tone became, and the more exotic their facial features got in comparison to his own. People recognized him as a weird stranger on sight, and were intensely suspicious of him the moment he approached them. The area he was currently in was especially bad, because it was very sparsely populated and the settlement he was in was the only congregation of mages for several hundred kilometers around. And the people inside it knew it. Which was why they were trying to bleed him dry whenever he tried to purchase their services. Oh well. It could be worse. He could still be attending classes at the academy, for one. Now that would have been a real nightmare. He did wonder how the original's date with Akoya went, though. He would have to pester the original for details again when he contacted him for his daily report. Tope continued,